1st and 2nd Peter and Jude. In this video, like all of our videos, we will be looking at the historical context and just the important kind of themes and passages from these three letters. Starting with 1st and 2nd Peter, the author is Peter. The same Simon Peter that we read about throughout the Gospels and early on in the book of Acts. He was a disciple of Jesus. Before he was a disciple, he was a fisherman, and Jesus famously says, you will now be a fisher of men. He was one of Jesus's closest companions. We know that Jesus had 12 disciples, but we also know that he had kind of an inner circle of 3, Peter, James, and John. John being the author of the Gospel John and the book of Revelation, and the 3 epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which we'll be looking at in a later class. James, not the author of James. Remember, the author of James was Jesus's brother, who probably didn't become a follower of Jesus until after the resurrection. And then Peter. And Peter, we saw in the book of Acts, he was one of the first leaders of the early church. He's the one who gives the big sermon at Pentecost. He's the one who goes and preaches to Cornelius and the Gentiles and baptizes them. And he's just a really important figure in the early church. And so these 2 letters were written by him. In the letters, he kind of makes reference to the fact that he knew Jesus personally. So there are numerous references in both letters to his personal knowledge of Jesus. For example, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "To the elders among you I appeal as a fellow elder, a witness of Christ's sufferings, and one who also will share in the glory to be revealed." So he's talking about how he witnessed how Jesus suffered. Also, 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, 'This is my Son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased.' We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain." So here Peter's referencing, there's the picture there, the transfiguration, where Jesus goes up on this mountainside and he brings along Peter, James, and John, and he's transfigured before them. And it says that his clothing was dazzling white, and beside him were Moses and Elijah, these 2 Old Testament figures. And a voice from heaven, God the Father, says, "This is my Son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased." So in both letters, Peter is kind of acknowledging this personal relationship he had with Jesus. And that's significant because Paul, for all of his writing in the New Testament, and as we saw, he did a lot of writing in the New Testament, Paul was not one of the 12 disciples. Paul actually never knew Jesus when Jesus was alive before his death. We know that he encountered Jesus in his resurrected form, right, in his conversion story, but Paul wasn't one of the disciples, and Peter was. And so we see that reflected in his letters, and we will also see that in John. John reflects kind of the fact that he was one of the disciples in his letters as well. Audience. So it's not a specific church. This, much like James and Hebrews, is a general epistle, a general letter, and it's written to kind of all of the persecuted believers scattered across the Roman Empire. And we know that from these kind of 2 verses that clue us in. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, "To God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood, grace and peace be yours in abundance." So that's kind of the introduction statement where Peter's saying who he's writing to. And you can see it's all over the place. It's not one particular community, one particular church. This would have been a circular letter, so it's something that he would have written and with the intention of it being passed around and read by numerous communities. And then we know that they were being persecuted because that's one of the major themes of the first book. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 14, he says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice, inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you." So there he's referencing this fact that they are suffering, that they are facing challenges because of their faith. And so we can say, looking at these two verses, that he's speaking to a scattered church, believers all over the place who are being persecuted. 1st and 2nd Peter. 1st Peter is really, you can kind of sum it up with the statement submission in suffering. Numerous times there are just different calls to submit and encouragement to endure in the midst of suffering. 1 Peter encourages the believers to continue to pursue obedience in faith, even though they are being persecuted. And he says, don't let your persecution hinder you from following God. Instead, all the more, find ways to obey God in the midst of your trials. And then 2 Peter, it's really all about the day of the Lord. So in 2 Peter, the focus turns to Jesus' return and warning against false teachers who are trying to lead the people astray. Jude. Jude is a tiny little epistle, much like Philemon, very short. The author was a guy named Jude. He identifies himself as the brother of James. And so we say, okay, he's the brother of the guy who wrote the book of James, and therefore also a brother of Jesus, which means he was not one of the 12 disciples, and probably wasn't a follower of Jesus when he was alive, but like the author of James, probably came to faith after Jesus rose from the dead. And that's it. We really don't know much else about him, aside from this letter that we have. And his audience is, again, it's a general letter, and so it's just written in general to Christians who are facing false teaching. So Jude, this little book, actually has a lot in common with 2 Peter. It's one academic theory is that there was this other document, which was kind of a way to refute false teaching, and that both Peter and Jude used it as a source. So they're kind of citing this material, and since they didn't have notions of plagiarism or copywriting or anything like that in the ancient world, they didn't cite their source, and so we don't know for a fact that that existed. That it's either that or one of the two letters, either 2 Peter or Jude, was written first, and then the other one kind of used it as a source. In either case, there are just numerous examples throughout both letters where they use the same idea, same example, and even in the same order. We're not going to look at all of them, but here's just one example. So in 2 Peter it says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment." And in Jude, it says, "And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their own home, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." So again, and we find this in Jude and in 2 Peter. They kind of pull these seemingly random examples of things, like the judgment of angels, really not mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament, but mentioned very specifically in both of these short books. And so that's something that a number of scholars have pointed out as an interesting feature of Jude and 2 Peter. And that's the gist of it, really. That's what you need to know about 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude.